we're going to zoom in a little bit on the kind of experiences and role of the Race Equity Associate. So we're going to hear from two of our Race Equity Associates on kind of different elements or phases of the kind of journey and process on advising and supporting evaluation design. And firstly, we're going to hear from Dr. Fatima Husain again. Thank you so much, Fatima, who's going to talk to us about the kind of good practice and also common challenges generally in the role of a Race Equity Associate and how to support evaluation design beyond everything you've heard so far of the specific experience on Solace Women's Evaluation. So over to you, Fatima, and we've got about 20 minutes or so.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks, Claren. I just realized I can't share, so that's great that it's up there. So thank you, YEF, and it's been a great experience being a Race Equity Associate, and I think that this initiative is fantastic. And what I'm going to talk about is something slightly broader in terms of how we need to think about race equity in evaluations or more broadly in research. Next slide, please. So the premise really I want to take is about a key approach that is three-pronged. So often when we're carrying out research and or evaluation, we think about quality assurance of the research design, the technical aspects of an evaluation. We think about the ethics, and then at the moment, the race equity bit is kind of on the side. It's a bolt-on at the moment for YEF, but for other evaluators, in a way, it doesn't exist. And the approach I want to propose is that actually race equity is a fundamental part of quality and ethics, and it should be embedded within the approach taken from the outset, which I feel in some ways is where YEF are heading. But I just wanted to set it out as, if you're thinking about quality assurance, you need to think about race equity. If you're thinking about ethics, you need to think about race equity also. Next slide, please. And by that, I'm just going to explain in the next few slides what I mean. So if you're thinking about your design, your research design, your evaluation design, and your sampling, which should lead to how you plan the delivery of the research, you need to think about who is writing the proposal and where, what they're thinking about, who is signing off the sampling approach, what level of layered thinking has gone into designing the sample. And I think Nathan touched upon the approach taken to sampling and having diverse experiences and diverse voices and so on. But if you're not starting to think about the equitable aspects of the research you're going to conduct from the outset, then you will end up with a research design and an approach and delivery, which then you will be adding little bits on here and there because you have not had that cohesive thought process from the outset. And we talk a lot about, holistic approaches and so on. And I think part of thinking holistically is about embedding the race equity lens within every aspect of your research design, planning and sampling. And some of the things we touched upon, Louise touched upon, are around religious holidays. We look at school holidays, but also prayer times. School inset days tend to be missed, if you're looking at young people and children. And part of this, I think, involves spending that time with developers at the outset, as well as spending time with the evaluators. So how much time do the developers spend with a race equity associate at this point? It's only for the evaluation, I assume, in the YEF model. Is it also important for that race equity associate to have spent some time with the intervention developers who've received the grant? So that's a question for YEF, really. And then again, the whole issue around interpretation, and I'll touch upon this because there are pros and cons to interpretation, who interprets for whom and what are the power dynamics within that interpretive relationship also need to be looked at, and whether there's an existing relationship and how skilled the interpreter is in actually carrying out interpretation without doing any advocacy at the same time in the way they support participants during an intervention delivery. So I think we tend to assume that if they're skilled interpreters, it's going to work well, without thinking of the specific requirements of an evaluation and what it means to interpret within an evaluation framework. And I think that's quite a critical question. And I don't know how often evaluators just reflect on that. One of the key things, I think, for me is the use of terminology. And I think I've had discussions with YEF around that and being consistent. The government has its stance, but there's something about how does an organization like YEF, or how do evaluators drive that narrative and drive the discussion so that we all get better at using the most suitable terminology possible. And Nathan and I, because we're in the same, have had Nathan and I, because we work at the same organization, have had discussions around, do you say mixed race or do you say multiple heritage? Can you say biracial? With Louise, we had discussions around the terminology also, do you use minoritized and racialized? Or do you say minority ethnic or minoritized groups? And I think it's really about entering into that reflective process and being consistent and and trying to drive forward the argument to get the best possible terminology and definitions being used. And I think YEF could play a great role there in terms of setting out, this is how we want you to talk about X, Y, and Z groups. Of course, I have my own personal preferences, which is around minoritized and racialized, but I see variation everywhere. And, the ONS has its own categories. The government seems to have reverted back to ethnic minority for the moment. So I think there is a space there for driving the narrative. We've talked a little bit about standardized tools and how useful they are. And I think I'll leave that to people who are more, who are experts in standardizing tools and so on, to really reflect on why are we using these tools? What are the theories embedded behind these tools, the development of these tools? If they're psychological theories, then were these developed by Western psychologists, and how do they relate to different cultural contexts or religious contexts, even if it's within the UK? And I think those are the kinds of tough discussions that no one's had yet. Where do these standardized tools come from, and what perceptions and theories are embedded within those tools? And I think finally, research burden. What does research burden mean for a community group? What does it mean for an individual taking part in an intervention? And the level of nuanced discussion I think this requires should be part and parcel of the ethics process, really, and set out and thought about during the design process. Next slide, please. Again, passing through from the design, sampling, and choice of materials is, if you look at qualitative research, or if you're designing your own survey, let's forget, I've got standardized tools here, but we've discussed that a little bit, is around, one, how do you tell people about the research? How do you develop topic guides, for example, if we're looking at qualitative research? And how do you recruit people? I think these are kind of three fundamental areas where it's always about written documents. And we think about, this is one of the discussions I had with Louise and Angela early on, is about the reading age. What is the UK's adult reading age? So the average reading age, I think, is 11 years. adult reading age in the UK. So then if you think about people who speak multiple languages, how might that affect their ability to read in English? How clear do people write? You know, we have all learned different way of writing. How easy is it for us to write in an accessible way? And what does a short sentence look like? You know, I think I find so many run-on sentences when I look at texts, when I look at proposals, for example, or reports. With Louise and Angela, we had a discussion about information overload and what is too much information and what is the right level of detail that you need to get to. And that's something that I think it's very difficult for researchers to get to the bottom of. And I think with Louise, with the emotional coaching, having that experts by experience group helped in terms of having a discussion around actually more information is needed. Then it becomes an issue of how is it presented. And it might not be the information that the researchers thought was important. It might be the, you know, for example, around what will happen to the data. How well are you explaining that? Or do you just have a few sentences around GDPR and, you know, they can contact the research team anytime to withdraw from the research? We talked about time burden. There's this issue around who's recruiting. And I think with the Solace Women's Aid one, it was quite a different process because the recruitment was carried out by the staff at Solace. There were trusted relationships. And I think trust is a very critical aspect, again, that researchers don't think about or evaluators don't think about, that how do you build trust with research respondents? And part of that is the clarity around the information you give them, the level of detail of information that they ask for is provided in a way that they can understand. And written documents are not always the right approach. So one of the questions I'd put to Louise and Angela was, well, why can't you have a sound file explaining the research, or make a video, you know, with two people talking about the research. So this like kind of like, and then that allows residents to, sorry, not residents, but participants to watch the video at their own leisure, or they can listen to the sound file multiple times. And why is this not standard practice, actually? Why is there the expectation that people should still be reading through 2 pages? I've seen 4-page information leaflets too. You know, why should a participant have to sit there, read through 4 pages of text when they could potentially listen to a sound file and comprehend it just as or more easily than having to read? And you have to think about the participants. Some people are maybe able to speak English and converse in it and understand it, but not read it. They may not be able to read in their own language either. So if you have a sound file, it's sometimes easier to translate a sound file also. So my question there is, why is that not standard practice? Why are we still producing written documents? And I'm sorry, I'm not giving answers. I'm asking questions and pointing out issues. But I think that's part of the process, I think, is important for this type of work. Next slide, please. And then finally, in analysis and reporting, and I know there's this whole kind of people talk about co-design and co-producing the findings. So there are lots of nice concepts and terms that we use without actually fully understanding the effort and time it takes to apply that in practice. And that's where I think that more effort is needed. You know, you can have peer researchers, but it's also, how do you interpret what people are telling you? You know, you come from a very specific educational, cultural mindset, live in a social research bubble, and you interpret the findings according to that bubble you inhabit. And if you go talk to another person, or if you go talk to a group of participants and say, oh, we were told X, Y, and Z, and this is how we're interpreting it. Where is that sense check that our interpretation is correct? And we make that assumption that because we have a few degrees and we work in research, that our interpretations are correct based on what somebody told us. What about the subtexts? What about contextual, nuanced discussions that take place within different groups of people who may interpret the same information, differently? And then again with reporting, this again about co-design, co-production, who helps identify recommendations? How are they the experts and know how to interpret the findings to come up with these recommendations, some policy recommendation? Whereas respondents might want the entire system changed, but we still make these very light touch recommendations around tweaking policies, adapting interventions. And then lastly, who can access the findings? Who can read it? Who is going to read it? And I don't know if YEF know who reads your research reports beyond our social research bubble, as I call it. Do you provide accessible findings to every, will they be accessible findings going out to, for example, Solace Women's Aid to share it with their residents? And they may be, and that's a good thing. And I think if that was also standard practice, and part of that is, again, it's not just providing the findings, but is the language accessible? Is there a sound file, or is there a short video talking about the findings of how things might change on the ground? And all of these bits that are part of the thinking through the protocol and writing the proposal, all of these have an equity angle to them. And to embed it is having that thinking and engaging in that reflective thinking from the very beginning. Next slide, please. I think this is nearly my last one, the second to last, my penultimate slide. So some suggestions for funders and evaluators. So I think we're all sitting at home potentially. So to look around you, you might not see what I would have liked you to see, but next time you're in the office, look around you, look at the professional world you inhabit, and look who's sitting next to you and what everyone looks like. This is our social research bubble. Unfortunately, that's what it is. And you have to kind of start kind of coming out of that. And I think that's really important. And we pay so much attention to the technical aspects of an evaluation and making sure we have the right, we carry out the power calculations and we have the right number of participants and the number of schools that are needed. But we need to come out from those technical boundaries and think a little bit beyond that in order to expand how we embed race equity. And then I think it's important to listen to how you talk. How do you talk to your colleagues? What do you talk about? Where did you go on holiday? All of these things are you're part of a specific culture. And no matter how hard you try to be different, you are still part of that context. And to be able to reflect on that, I think, is the most critical thing that any evaluator and researcher can do. That I'm going out to carry out the study, and I'm coming from this specific lens, this specific approach, this specific culture, which is a way of speaking, doing, eating, thinking. And we would all help ourselves by actually having that few moments of reflection, even before any interview, that we carry out or a proposal that we write. And thirdly, it's not just about who is around you, who you talk to, but how you move in spaces. You know, I remember telling somebody around, and this is quite an extreme example, is I was followed around in a women's clothing store on Regent Street once, and I was with my son, he was younger, and he's like, and he got quite agitated and said, "Oh, the security guard is following her. Why do you, following us? Why do you think the security guard is following us?" And I said, "Oh, I'll go talk to him and confront him," and which is my way of doing things. And my son's like, "No, no, 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 let's just leave, and we left. Now, I remember my mother, when I grew up in Manchester, saying that she walked into Selfridges, there used to be Selfridges there, or some such department store, and said the security guard was following, not security, the sales assistants were following her around every time she went into those shops. Now we're going back quite a few years. Some things haven't changed. And this is where how you move around in the space you occupy is the space where you feel privileged enough to walk around and not have to think about such things. A young Black man walking around who will be like, "Oh, there's a police car. I'm going to cross the road and walk down the side street." You may never think about that. I live near Tooting Broadway in London, and I went out of the station one day, and there was the facial recognition vans, and they were there every single day for 2 or 3 weeks. And I took photos of them just to annoy them. And I stared at a cop because 3 young Black young men walked by, and the dirty look this policeman gave them was astounding. Like they had done nothing. They were just walking by, but it was the side kind of glance, like sideways suspicious glance. So if you live with that day in and day out, how you move in spaces is affected. And we need to think more about that. We need to kind of be reflective of that throughout the research process. I'll try to go through these questions I have quickly. So having, these types of reflections are really important. And I think what's really important for YEF and for evaluators is to really think about the root cause of the problem. We're always intervening with children in school settings, and this goes back to the comment with Nathan's work around the education system. Do you trust social workers? Do you trust teachers? Do you trust the police? And if you do, to any extent, then your world is very different from some of the respondents that you're studying. And why is it that they are the ones you're intervening with? Does the problem lie with them? The ones who are counted, who are researched, for whom nothing changes much. And I think having that thought process, and I'm not saying go down and, tomorrow we'll all be dismantling the Home Office. I know that's not possible. But to have that thought and to be aware of that, I think is an important step towards race equity. And my final slide now, please. So some other suggestions, one which I've mentioned is the consistency in the use of terminology and that commitment to constantly think about and contextualizing your own lived experience and how that privileges you when you go and carry out research with groups that are vulnerable. And there has to be, I really think what YEF have done is great, because they've brought in a level of accountability which hasn't existed before in terms of how evaluations are conducted. And I think that level of accountability that YEF have, are trying to embed should be strengthened as much as you can. Daniel, there you go. And part of that is also about how YEF or any other What Works Center or the government functions in terms of management and governance and the expectations they have from evaluators and what they fund, the interventions they fund and the evaluations they fund. And to, again, have that reflective process as really important funders in this space. And to end then with a quote, don't let your critical discourse be betrayed by a lack of coherence between the denouncement of oppressive conditions, but with an accommodation to dominant structures that create those oppressive structures. And I think that's really, really important. And that's where I find interventions are always about young people, the problems with young people, or problems with their parents, problems with their culture, problems with their neighborhood potentially, but where do these problems arise from? We shouldn't forget. And I think that's a starting point of thinking about race equity. Where does the problem come from? And what's your positioning within that? So a broad sweep, because I think there is a big picture to race equity, but I'm really pleased about what YEF are doing. But I think it's really important to keep going and go further and do it with more intensity. Thank you.